This is a bit special for me in the sense that it's the first time that we do a series like this where, well, I don't exactly know how long this is going to take. It's the first time that I do something like this about programming language as well. So we'll have to see how this works. When I planned this, I kind of expected not too many people to show up. And I thought that if I had 5 or 10 people who wanted to learn, that it would be a lot. Actually, at the moment, you're 35. So I don't know what all of you are coming over here for, but it might be more boring than you expect. The purpose of this and the reason that I wanted to do this is because at every event that we organize and every time we talk about pdfToolbox, and now it also comes up with Switch, the problem is that a lot of the functionality in pdfToolbox, for example, starts relying on JavaScript. And there are a lot of people who either have only had a little bit of exposure to JavaScript or not at all, or who are not even developers. And then the question is, what do you do with such people? Well, you can try to teach them something. So this is what this is about. The assumptions that I'm making, and this is kind of important because if my assumptions aren't correct, then you, the audience, are going to be the ones suffering from this. So the assumptions that I am making are that you either don't know JavaScript or you haven't been exposed to it very much, or you think you still have something to learn. And that either you might or you might not know other programming languages. And this is kind of important, of course, because if you know other programming languages, the concepts will probably copy quite easily to JavaScript. If you have never done anything with programming, then it's a lot more difficult. I am going to assume that people don't know much about programming. So those of you who know a lot about it, it might be boring at some points, and you can keep yourself occupied and quietly in the corner in that case. I am going to assume that you're interested in JavaScript because otherwise there is no point to being here. In fact, it would actually be quite interesting for me to know a little bit more about what all of you who are deciding after this session to come back to the other ones, what you know about JavaScript and what not, or about development and what not. And I will start a topic in the website for the Café, which is on Facebook. So there is a group page for 4Ps Café that you can join. I will start a topic there to ask you about what your expectations for this series are, if you have any, and what prior experience you might have had with JavaScript and other languages. Anything that you care to post there will help me in doing a better job here. If you don't want to join Facebook because it's the big enemy, I fully understand. In that case, feel free to just email me, and you have my email address there as well. So just send me a mail and we can talk that way as well. This also goes, because this is supposed to be a series and I will try to build on previous sessions. This also goes for that. If you have questions, if there is stuff that doesn't work, you shouldn't just assume that it will get clearer or clearer in the next session. It probably won't. So because we are going to build from one session to the other, if you get stuck at some point, just ask on Facebook or send me an email and we'll look at it. The Facebook group would be good because that way then other people can help as well and you might get an answer quicker. So that's for the assumptions. Goals are, and that should not be a surprise because I already posted that with the introduction to this series. The goals, as far as I'm concerned, are to get you to be familiar with JavaScript, and that includes knowing or understanding at least the major language features, and also some of the tools that are involved. I don't expect you to be an expert in JavaScript when this is over. Actually, I don't think I'm an expert in JavaScript. I happen to know some things, but being an expert is still something else, I think. But the goal is to be a little bit more familiar than you all are at the moment. And hopefully, I can also give you an interest in solving stuff with code. That image on the first page of people who write code, always writing code, is not a complete joke, by the way. It is far too close to the truth to be funny. So if you start doing this, be aware that some of this stuff is a little bit addictive. But that's the fun in it. So let's talk about JavaScript. And before we look, we're actually not going to look at JavaScript today. Well, no, that's not true. We're going to look at one line of JavaScript at least. Because I want to talk about the tools. I want to set up the environment we're going to be using. And if at all possible, I would advise you to follow along. But let's start with giving a little bit of context. If you hear about JavaScript, this is a bunch of stuff that you actually might run across. And I think it's important to at least know a little bit what these things are, especially if you start reading on the internet, or if you look for stuff on the internet. You will have a better understanding of what you read and whether it's, well, makes sense for what you're looking for. A little bit of history. JavaScript was developed as, well, original name was Mocha or JScript, where also comes from that, that initial period. People from Netscape involved. If you still know what that is, you're at least as old as I am. People from Netscape involved. There was a lot of political infighting in the JavaScript history. I've never known that. I read a little bit about the history on the internet, and it's actually quite interesting. So both Mocha and JScript go back to history. Other than that, it's not very interesting. JavaScript is the way I'm used to writing it. It's wrong. It's supposed to be with a capital S, but it's always looked better this way. I can't promise I'm going to keep writing it correctly through the rest of this course. You can blame me. Java has nothing to do with JavaScript. Please remember this. If you want to talk to other developers and you want to come over as a developer yourself, there is no quicker way to fail than to call JavaScript Java or vice versa. Java is a completely different programming language. One that I think you shouldn't learn. There are nicer languages. But anyway, it's a completely different language, and we're not going to talk about it again. It is JavaScript. TypeScript is connected to JavaScript. They call it a superset. So you might see it show up in the same questions as where they talk about JavaScript. Just be aware it's not exactly the same thing. We haven't talked about type all that much, but we will. And I will complain about the fact that JavaScript is not a very typed language. And you'll understand a little bit more what TypeScript is once we've done that. Node.js is important. This is not just because it is used very often today, but also because it's the environment we will try to set up for ourselves, where we can experiment with things as we go further. So that is something that we are definitely going to talk about more. In fact, I'm going to have you install Node.js in a few minutes on one of the next slides. ECMAScript. That sounds like a competitor to Corona, but it is actually the official name for JavaScript. ECMA is the organization, it's a standards organization. They develop a list of standards. ECMAScript is one of those. And so if you want to be completely correct or very pedantic, you call it ECMAScript and not JavaScript. And then, as in any standard, standards come with different versions. So you have version 5, version 6. Those are often referred to as ES5, ES6, and so on. They are also sometimes referred to by the year that they were released. It is something that is actually very common. So you might see ES215, ES216, and so on. You have to be a little bit careful about that, because ES 2015, for example, is the same as ES6. So there is a little bit of a disconnect between the versions. Leave it to a standards organization to come up with namings, a naming scheme that doesn't work very well. And then JSON is something that we will already see a little bit today. A JSON is a textual way to write JavaScript objects. You can store that in a file, for example, or in a database, and so on. We don't know, or you don't know what objects are yet, but that is not important. JSON is a way to store JavaScript in a text form. So, some terminology. Now, the important question is, if I want to teach you JavaScript, or at least the basics of JavaScript, which of those versions I talked about do I need to use? And that's a little bit of a complicated story, because it depends on the environment where you use JavaScript. So if you look at modern browsers, then you can more or less assume that it will support everything up to ES6, which, as we just saw, corresponds to ES 2015. So that's 5 years old. All of that is supported. And that is more or less the same thing as what you see in Node.js, for example. It is the same thing as what you see in pdfToolbox. It supports at least ES6 and probably a whole bunch of more modern features as well. Yeah.
Oh,
the difficult bit in that list is Switch. The new version of Switch scripting that was announced and is now released, as far as I know, is based on Node.js, and there is no problem. If you look at what Switch has been using for the last 15 years, then there is a problem. The Switch scripting engine was invented in 2005. It was state of the art at that point, and it hasn't changed all that much since then. So it is absolutely not state of the art right now. Yeah, that legacy engine uses, I looked in the documentation says it is based on JavaScript 4. That is a lie, because JavaScript 4 was never released. So I have no idea what version of JavaScript it's based on, but it is old. And this is relevant information because some of the stuff, and actually some pretty basic things, are not supported by that older version of JavaScript. So that's a little bit of the difficult one in this whole picture. So we're going to talk about ES6 Plus. ES6 because that's a good base version. It is supported across the board by just about everything except Switch. And ES6 Plus because there are some interesting topics that we might want to cover. Asynchronous JavaScript, for example, with promises and async await, and there is destructuring and stuff like that. That is interesting, and it makes for an interesting thing to talk about once we are a little bit more on the advanced side of things. So we'll see whether we get to that. Is there a chance that this causes trouble? Like you saw on the previous slide, I think on anything that is relatively modern stuff, it's not going to cause an issue. The browsers that you might be running JavaScript in, Node where you might be running JavaScript in pdfToolbox, they're all going to support what we do. If not, if at some point you want to go back to something that is older, there is something called transpiling, and I'll give you an example of that or a tool that can do that in a couple of slides as well. So it is possible to take modern JavaScript syntax and convert it, translate it into older syntax, and that is typically called transpiling. For Switch, there is only one advice: use older stuff and read the documentation, because just using old syntax is also not a complete guarantee. You really need to read the documentation and see what is supported and what is not supported. So this is the bit where you do some stuff as well. And if you want to follow these classes, then I would highly advise you to also follow along with what I'm saying here and do this. There are two tools that I would like you to install. You have this one here, which is the Visual Studio Code, and let me see if I can put this also in the chat, because from there you might actually be able to copy and paste it. But there is Visual Studio Code that I am going to use in what I'm doing in examples and so on. And I am going to assume that you have that. So if you have a text editor that you like much better, I completely appreciate that, but it would still be a good idea, unless you're very comfortable with development already, and maybe also a little bit comfortable with Node.js, for example. I would advise you to still download Visual Studio Code and install it. At least on Windows and Mac, you can do so. I'm not sure about Linux, but at least on Windows and Mac, you can download it. It is free. So please do that now. And while I'm going through the rest of the slides, if you could go through the installer as well, that would be a good idea, because we're going to set up a test environment for us in the rest of this presentation. And I'm going to use Visual Studio Code for that. So this is one. It is actually a great editor. Even though it is from Microsoft, it's still great. It supports a whole bunch of stuff and we're not going to use all of that, but well, you see what it says there. It supports workspaces and stuff and syntax coloring, but it also has modules that allow it to be extended. And I use quite a bit of that in the JavaScript work that I do. So download it and go through the installer while I'm going through the rest of my slides, please. And then the same for Node.js. I hesitated a little bit whether I was going to use Node.js as an environment to do the rest of these classes in, or a website that I'll show to you in a second as well. But I decided on Node.js mainly because this is also now the environment that Switch is going to use for a scripting environment. So it is something you are very likely to get some exposure to. Some of this might sound like magic if you start using it and you don't have any experience with command line tools and so on, but we'll do our best to make it understandable. There is an installer there. If you could download that and go through the installation as well while I'm going through the rest of the slides.
Sorry,
that
David.
would be good.
Sorry, David, Christian speaking. On the Node.js, where you want to download that, for example, what I have here for macOS, I have two versions, 12.18.2 LTS, which says recommended for most users, and 14.5.0 current, the latest feature. Which one do we have to download?
We are definitely most users.
Okay.
So it's a good question. I would use this one. Yeah. The latest features one, I'm sure, is not a bad idea either. But the 12.18.2 is what I use for development purposes as well. So definitely download that one. Thanks, Christian. Good question. The title here on the slide also mentions something NPM. You will see that people really like abbreviations in this when you start with development as well. NPM stands for Node not process manager. Oh, come on. Package manager, thank you. So Node package manager, and it is something that we will use. You don't have to install it because it is installed by Node.js itself. So if you go through that Node.js installer, then you will get NPM as well. By the way, if you're a developer who knows more about this, well, then the question is why you're here. You won't learn much today for sure. But if you know about Node and you've worked with it, of course, you don't have to reinstall anything. As long as you have it on your machine, it's absolutely fine. There are other ways of getting Node on your machine. There is NVM, Node Version Manager, for example, that lets you install multiple versions. We're not going to complicate things to that amount here, but if you already have done that, then that's fine. So this one, Visual Studio Code, and this one for Node, please download, go through the installer, and you shouldn't be able to do too much damage in the installer. Just follow the defaults and you'll get something that is good enough for our purposes. What I originally was going to use is a site called Replit. And Replit is, you can look it up. We don't need any other tool. So we're done with that part. We'll get to use them in a second. But Replit is an environment, a website where you can write code and execute code without having to install anything. And it's actually a quite nice concept. So you could also go to the Replit website and type JavaScript code and run it and see the result and so on. So for prototyping, or if you want to test something, or you're online, Matteo. I've muted you now. So if you want to test something, this is a good website to do it. It supports much more than just JavaScript, by the way. It also does Swift and a whole bunch of other languages. And you can do most of it for free to begin with. So if you want to test something in some programming language, this is a great site. There are also some other resources that might become useful at some point. I've just listed them here so that you see them as well. But I've also listed them so that you know the concepts. I already talked about this transpiling thing, which, if you remember, was converting new JavaScript to older syntax so that an older browser can run it, for example. Classic example of that one is Babel, babel.js.io. You can have a look at what that does. If you get stuck, if you're trying to do something, you're trying to learn, or if I give you homework and you don't know how to do it, very good website to ask questions is Stack Overflow. For developers, this is like heaven in many cases. And in general, if you just go to Google and you search something that is development related, the chance that you end up on the Stack Overflow workflow, on Stack Overflow website rather, is pretty high. So remember that one. If you get homework and you decide to ask questions on Stack Overflow, be careful. I do have an active account there, and I will tell you that you have to do your homework yourself. So you're warned. Two others that might become useful at some point, not immediately, are regex 101, where you can test regular expressions, you can build them. If you have a regular expression from somewhere else, then you can copy and paste it there and then get some explanation on it. If you don't know what a regular expression is, that's not the end of the world for now. We don't really need it at the moment. JSON editor online, I told you what JSON is, so a textual way to represent JavaScript objects, stands for JavaScript object notation. You can on this website, copy paste stuff there, and then see whether, first of all, see whether it's legal. You can also see it in a structured rendition to examine it a little bit in more detail. Can be very nice when you deal with JSON files. Two other things and two opposite things, actually. The first one is the concept of linting. I think you should at least hear that term. For the non-native English speakers, lint is the small crap, by lack of a better word, that you find in a pocket, for example. So dirt, really. And linting is technology to clean up code, and JavaScript is code, so you can use that for that. There are specific tools like ESLint, but there are definitely other ones as well that can help you to clean up the code that you write. And with clean up, what we mean, for example, is some developers feel that you should not use tabs, but you should do everything with spaces. And specifically, for example, indentation should be done with 2 or 4 or 8 spaces, depending on the person. Well, those kinds of tools can help you to enforce that. And especially in bigger projects, that can be quite nice, because then you're sure that everyone in the project follows the same guidelines, which makes code easier to read and makes it easier for people to cooperate with each other. I have that built into my Visual Studio text editor. You might see that later, that it will clean up code automatically. So I'll mention that when we open up Visual Studio Code. And then obfuscation of JavaScript is actually the opposite, if you want. It is making code ugly. And you could wonder why that is important. Well, mostly from a security point of view. Some JavaScript will be open to the public if you want. For example, JavaScript that is used in a website to handle form validation and a bunch of other stuff might be visible or will be visible in the website itself. So if I use the developer tools in Chrome or in Safari, I would be able to just take a look and see what it does. And some people feel that the code either has to be secured a little bit, or they don't want others to just be able to steal their code. And you can use an obfuscation tool to take something that is legible and nicely written JavaScript that everyone will understand and turn it into something that gives you nightmares when you look at it. But it still would do the same thing when you run it. So that's an obfuscator. There are many different tools that do it. Obfuscator.io is an example of that. If you want to see what that looks like, just go there, and they have a way of doing that on the website, and it will be immediately obvious. Okay, so I had a second part to this presentation that I am not going to do, because hopefully I know by heart what I'm supposed to do. And this is about setting up an environment. So I hope you followed along and you set up the two tools that I pointed to. So Visual Studio Code on the one hand and Node.js on the other hand. And if you have done that, you will be able to follow along with what I'm doing here. What I'm doing is a little bit upside down, if you want, because before we start looking at JavaScript, we're going to set up a JavaScript environment. But the whole purpose is to give you an environment where we will then be able to write code and very quickly see whether that code is good or not good and what the result is. If you haven't done development before, it will sound really, really wrong, but I will say it a couple of times. If you're a good developer, you should be as lazy as possible. And that means that you should set up an environment where it takes not a lot of effort to try something. The less effort it takes to try something, the more you are bound to try things and the better your code is going to be as a result. So that is what we're going to do here. Yeah? What you need is Visual Studio Code. You will need a folder somewhere on your system where we are going to put subfolders for each class that we do. And it's not 100% required, but if you look at where this folder lives on my system, you'll see it lives under users, DVD, and then term Café. There are no spaces in this path, and that is not a coincidence. Yeah. Spaces in paths in general are perfectly fine. Sometimes, especially when you deal with command line tools, it's just a little bit easier if they're not in there. If you don't have another option, for example, because your user name here has this in it, that should not be an issue. Yeah? But I typically try to avoid it if I'm working with command line tools. It makes things a little bit more predictable sometimes. So we need Visual Studio Code and we need a folder somewhere, and that's enough to get started. As I said before, if you have questions, unmute yourself and speak up, please. I'm going to go through a number of steps. I will try to do it in a very slow and consistent way, hoping that all of you can follow. The goal really is to have a working node environment for all of you once we are done with this. So if you get stuck, don't hesitate, but speak up. So let's start Visual Studio Code. And in my case, it already launches something. I'm going to close that and say new window. And then I should see the same as you see if you haven't used Visual Studio Code before. Yeah. It might look different in the sense that Visual Studio Code supports themes. It also supports integrated modules and so on. So it might have a little bit of a different look. There might be a different font used or coloring used. Those things can all be configured. Microsoft, again, surprisingly, has a pretty good website with documentation for Visual Studio Code. So if you want to go through the trouble of configuring what you have here so that you like it, then please do. It is not that difficult. The editor opened an empty file for me. That is fine for now. And here on the left-hand side, you should see a number of buttons. I don't know whether they will be the same as what I have because, for example, I'm not sure about the last one here. I've already installed a bunch of modules for Visual Studio Code, and modules can modify the interface. So again, it might look a little bit different. What we are going to use is this one here, which is a folder file browser, if you want. And the cool thing about that is that if you have the main folder for your project in here, then you'll be able to neatly see all the files underneath. And there are a bunch of other advantages. So this is what we are going to use. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this Café folder that I created and just drop it on top of Visual Studio Code. And that should set my Café folder as the root folder of the workspace I have here. Actually, I don't have a workspace yet because I haven't saved it, but it now is the root folder in this window. And because I want to, next week, for example, just want to pick up where we left off, I'm also going to go to File and then say Save Workspace. And I'm going to save that. We'll call it Café. And let me save it. Well, actually, I'm going to save it inside of my Café folder. Then everything is in one spot. So inside of that folder, that main folder that we have, and I gave it a name. You can give it another name. It's not important as long as you save it somewhere. And you can see that that file now also appears in our file list, of course, because, well, it's in the folder that we're looking at. From now on, even after you quit Visual Studio Code. If you reopen it, it will normally automatically reopen what you had opened before. But if it forgets, then you can double click on the workspace there, and that should give you exactly the same environment as we have now. Now, we're doing a class here, so if you hover over Café, where it states the folder name, you'll see that you have capabilities here to create a new file or a new folder. We're going to create a folder for this session that we're doing. And because we're assuming that we're going to do more than one, we'll call this session 1. Again, no spaces in there because it's just easier. Of course, I could just as well have created a new folder by doing new folder in the Finder. There is no real difference between the two. Sometimes just nice to have everything in the same environment here. Yeah, so this file and folder explorer is actually quite handy, and I very often just keep it open to work with things. You have a search button here that allows you to search throughout a workspace if you want. There is a repository, a source control repository built into Visual Studio Code that is outside of the scope of what we're doing here, so we're not going to spend more time on this. There is a debugger built into Visual Studio Code, and we might actually use that at some point. I do want to show this, what they call extensions. And Microsoft has a complete website with extensions for Visual Studio, which is their main development environment, but also for Visual Studio Code. And as you can see, there are a bunch of things here that I have installed already. You don't have to install those, but I would urge you to have a look at what is available if you feel like you like Visual Studio Code, because this can help you to customize what it does. And in some cases, in a quite nice way. For example, I have installed Prettier, which is a ESLint type of environment. So it's an extension that can help you with cleaning up code as you write it. But I've also installed some additional stuff. So this is ESLint itself for code corrections and checking and so on. You can see some stuff about ES6 in here, but also some stuff about Node.js and NPM, and so on and so on. So there are lots of extensions that you can install. You don't really need to install any of them, but it might make your life easier if you have a look around and install some of the stuff that is recommended. And you can install it directly from here. You can search for things and then click install, and then it will install that if you want to as well. For now, let's go back to the Explorer. And what I want to do in the time that we have remaining today is I want to build an environment. And the environment is going to be based on Node.js. Yeah? That is why I had you install Visual Studio Code. It is why I had you install Node.js. So you don't really know what Node.js is yet. And you don't really need to. All I'm going to say at the moment is it is a JavaScript-based framework that allows you to run JavaScript code, and then you can build different types of applications with it. So it is JavaScript that is then not used inside of pdfToolbox or in Switch or in a browser environment, but you can run standalone JavaScript, and you can build command line tools with it. You can build web servers or web services with it. We are going to use it as a development framework. And that is because I think it will be easy, but also because I want to expose you to the Node.js environment, because that by itself is important to understand. So we created a folder here. And this folder doesn't contain anything, so let's put something in there. And you have another button here that says New File. So if I click that New File then it's going to create files for me. You can also just, and sometimes that's easier because, or more secure because it will show you where it is going to end up. So I can click on anything in this Explorer and then do the new file from there. And then I'm sure it puts it in the correct folder as well. And I'm going to call this index.js. You can be as creative as you want, but in this case, I would follow my lead and also call it index.js. You'll see in a second why. So that gives me a JavaScript file. Yeah. And I'm going to do a terrible crime for a teacher. I'm going to ask you to type something in that we haven't talked about at all, but it's just so that we can test. So I'm going to say console log, and then you can just type in a string there. And when I save this, and I think it will do it, so watch this, when I save this, you can see that it removed a blank line for me and it changed the spacing. That is actually because I have this prettier extension built in and active, and that will clean up my code every time I save it. So I'm typing this because this is a piece of JavaScript code that will do something. What it does is it takes a string. You don't know what a string is, but this is one. It takes a string and it writes it to the console, and the console is a text area where you can then see that something was happening. All of that is not important. We haven't seen functions or console or variables or anything like that, but we'll get to that. What is important is that if you have this exactly the way I type it, then it should actually work. If it doesn't work, then Node will tell you in a second, don't worry. So I have a file with some JavaScript in it, and I have that in a folder, but this is not a Node project, if you want. If I want this to be a Node environment, a Node project, if I want Node to know what I want to do here, then I have some extra steps that will make my life a little bit easier, and that we're going to do. And in order to do that, unfortunately, you need to use command line tools. If you haven't done that, don't worry. I will, again, go through all the steps and you should be able to follow without too many problems. One of the reasons for choosing Visual Studio Code is that there is a terminal built in. Of course, you can use something else. Normally, I use an application called iTerm. But the built-in terminal has some advantages. It will appear in the same window and so on. So that's not a bad thing. The only downside is that if I choose new terminal here, you'll see that that opens up at the bottom and it puts us in the folder for the Café. So it actually puts us in this folder at the top level. And we don't want to turn this top level into a Node project. We want to turn this session 1 in there. So I'm going to delete this one. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before, right click on session 1. And you should have something that is called Open Terminal. And when you do that, it opens it up directly into the session 1 folder. And that puts you where we want to be. I can check that. How I check it depends on the platform. But for example, on Mac, if you type pwd, print working directory, it will show you the folder that you're in. And you can see that I am in the session 1 folder. So that's where I want to be. And I'm going to say clear so that I have a blank page here. So we want to turn this folder into a Node project. How do we do that? It's actually, as I said before, it will look a little bit like magic, but there is good documentation for all of this stuff if you want to read more about what is going on. In order to do this, I'm going to use NPM, Node Package Manager, and NPM can turn this into a Node project. How? Well, I will type npm space, and then one of the npm commands, which is init. And when I do that, it's going to ask me questions. And because we were smart, we can accept the default answer for most of them. So package name, and it suggests session 1, that is fine with me. Version is fine. I don't need a description. Entry points. Well, I told you to create a file called index.js, and so that's the one that I want to use as an entry point. If you created a file with a different name, you could just type the name that you've given that file, the JavaScript file earlier, but I'm happy with index.js. I don't want a test command at the moment. I don't care about Git repositories. I don't have any keywords. I will be possessive and I will type my own name there. I don't care about the license. And when it asks me, is this okay? The default is yes, so I can do enter again. Yeah, so the init command takes a folder and it will turn it into a Node.js project, environment, call it what you want. And the way it does that is by creating an additional file in that folder. You can see that I now have a file called package.json. This is one of those JSON files that we talked about. So a way to represent a JavaScript object in a textual form. And you can see all the information that we entered. So whatever you entered while you did this init is now in this package.json file. Why is this important? I mean, I could run this JavaScript file without going through the step of converting it into a Node.js package. It is important because in a Node.js environment, you have the ability to work with modules. And that means that you don't have to write the code, all of the code yourself. You can just import stuff that other people have written. And if you want to work with modules and so on, you have to work in a Node.js project. And that is what we're setting up here. And we'll actually use one of those packages because it's going to save us a lot of typing afterwards. Yeah. So let's see whether we did the right thing here. If you installed Node correctly, you should be able to type Node space and then a dash and then V. And when you do that, it should answer with the Node version that you installed, which is 12.16.1 or 2 or whatever the current Node version is that you downloaded from the Node.js website. Yeah, so I have Node installed. That means that I could say node index.js. Depends a little bit on platform. On some platforms, you might have to add this to the front, which basically means look in the current directory. So when I do this, I am asking Node to execute this JavaScript file that we created. And that JavaScript file contained only one line, if you remember, this console log. And you see what that does. It writes whatever we have in that string, writes that out to the console. Yeah. And if I change the string and I save it, and I do this again, and you can either retype the whole thing or you can do arrow up on most platforms. And then you get the previous command. When I do it again, it shows my modified string. So actually, this gives us an environment that we can use to run JavaScript. Yeah. This is not good enough, of course, because now every time we make a change, I have to save it here. And then I have to go to the terminal, and I have to type this in, and then it's going to run it. I try to be lazy when I can, so this is too much work. So let's try something else. and improve our life a little bit. When you look at this package.json file, you'll see that there is an area in there that is called scripts. And those are scripts that can be run. Well, that makes sense. So we're going to add one for us to make our life easier. And the way to do that, we'll start looking at JavaScript syntax next week. But for now, just trust me that you need a comma at the end of the test line there. And then I'm going to make a dev script. And in that dev script, I'm going to type exactly what we had before. So don't forget the comma. Then dev colon, and then between quotes, you have node index.js, which is the thing we used in the terminal before. And when you have that, I'm going to save that. And now I have a package.json file that has an additional script that is called dev. And now if I remember the syntax, we can do in our terminal something else. So instead of running node, I'm going to run npm again, this package manager. And I'm going to say npm run. Run is a command that can run scripts. And which scripts? Well, the scripts that we define in the package.json file. So I can say npm run dev. Dev, because that is what we defined in there. And when I do that, I get the same result. So npm looks at the JSON file, the package file. It finds the script called dev, and it runs that script. And the result, you can see here what it runs, node index.js, and it says penguins. Yeah. So why would I do this? Well, of course, same thing. If I modify my string, I can save my JavaScript file. And then once I've saved my JavaScript file, all I have to do now is to repeat that npm run dev, and it's going to do this. Now, this doesn't sound like we've gained a lot, to be honest. This seems like a lot of effort and complication for very little gain, and you're absolutely right. Were it not that there is a very nice package that we can now use to make our life easier. Which package? Well, let me clear this again. So what would be really cool is if I could change this JavaScript and then save it. And the minute I save it, it is auto-magically run. That would be really cool, because that would give me a really nice environment to test with. All I would have to do is typing, modifying something, hit Command S to save, and in the console, I would see what is happening. That's the environment that we want. And you can have that environment if you install something, one of the Node modules that is made exactly for that. How do you install a Node module? Well, we use npm, the package manager. So npm, I want to install something. What do I want to install? Well, a package. And the package is called nodemon. Yeah, so just node followed by mon. The only thing that is special is that this is a package that is typically used while you're doing development. So trust me on this one. I'm just going to add -save-dev. Yeah? No spaces, just one word there. And when I run that, you should see that it goes through a whole bunch of stuff. And more than likely, you will get some warnings at the end as well. That's not a bad thing necessarily. In this case, it warns me. npm tells me that I have no description and no source control, which we know because we elected not to bother by that. Yeah, so I did npm, where is my command again? I did npm install, which is used for installing a node module. I chose to install nodemon, and I said save dev. Why save dev? Well, look at your package file now, and you'll see that the nodemon package is included under a key called dev dependencies. So we've told Node that this package is important to us and we want to use it, but we only want to use it in our development environment. If we go to a production environment with this, this is not something that we would need. And the other stuff that you see here is just the way that Node knows that it needs nodemon and it needs this version. In this case, we just got the latest version. There are ways to, for example, if I would say 2.0.0, I would instruct npm to give me that specific version and so on. So there are ways to play with these version numbers. I'm not going to do that. We just have the latest version, which is absolutely fine. What you'll also see is if you look in your folder, there is now another file here, package lock.json. You can look at that one and it contains a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah, we don't need to know what this is. This is absolutely fine. And you have an additional folder, which is called node modules. So all these node modules that I talked about, the things that other people have written and that we can now just use, all of those get installed in that node modules folder. Yeah? So all of that was done by this npm install nodemon save dev command. If you install modules in Node.js, and it's a little bit early to start doing that because we're just getting going here with JavaScript, but if we get to the point where we talk about Node.js more, installing modules is always done with a similar command. Yeah? An install command, nodemon. There are a number of other commands in npm that you might at one point use. For example, I could do npm updates, and then it would check whether something needs to be updated. I can do npm install, which would check my file and see again if something is not there, and it would install it if it's not there. So there are a number of, there's actually a long list of things that npm can do for you, but we're done. We've done what we wanted to do. We've installed the nodemon package, and that's what we wanted to do. And we're going to make one last change here. Instead of saying node index.js, I'm going to change that to nodemon index.js. Yeah? Nodemon for this new package that we installed. And this is still the JavaScript file that we want to run. Yeah. When you've done that, save it. And I'm going to go back here and we can do clear. And the same as before, I want to run the dev script. So npm run dev. And if we did it properly, this is the last time we need to do this. There. So what happened? Well, nodemon ran our index.js file. You can see that because it wrote penguins on in the output. And then it says, your process stopped. I am waiting for changes before a restart. What does that mean? Well, it means if I go back to my index file and make a change, I'm just going to add another console log in here. So as long as I don't save, nothing is going to happen. The minute that I go to save, you can see that that change, the fact that my file was changed, was noticed by nodemon, and it automatically ran my file again, and it now writes penguins and stuff. And then it says again, I'm waiting for a restart. So what we've done is we've built a Node.js environment, a very simple one, where I have a main file called index.js, and I am using nodemon to watch actually watch this session 1 folder. Anything that changes inside of that session 1 folder, so any JavaScript file that changes inside of there or in any subfolder in there, is going to automatically trigger that my command is run again. And so this makes it really easy to test stuff, because now I could replace this with anything that we want. Yeah? I can write whatever JavaScript commands that we want to play with, and I'm always immediately going to have the answer. The only thing I need to do is make the edits and then save my file, and that is going to trigger NodeMon. NodeMon is going to keep running as long as you don't stop it explicitly. And to stop it explicitly, you hit Control-C, and you're back to your command prompt. Yeah? So once more, the command that we're using is here in my package.json file. So all I have to do is npm run dev script. And from that point on, it is going to work. Yeah, and that gives us an environment to play in. What I will do next class is I will make a folder for session 2, and I'll go through the same steps just as a reminder, but that will take 2 minutes. We'll turn that folder 2 into a node project. But actually, I wouldn't really need to do that if I would, this is the beauty of this, if I would just duplicate this folder and I call it session 2 now, that would give me a second folder in here. And if I want to do it cleanly, I would change the name to number 2, and I can start NodeMon in that folder, and we're up and running. So for Node.js projects, you can either start, I'm going to delete this again. For Node.js projects, you can either go through these steps with npm init, and then installing the modules that you want, and so on and so on. So you can do that. Or once you have something that works, you can just copy that, duplicate it somewhere, and then you again have a working folder. The beauty is that there is nothing else stored anywhere else. All of the configuration is actually inside of that folder. Yeah. If at some point you think that something is wrong, you could delete the node modules and the package lock.json. So I can throw those away as well. And yes, I deleted that, so that's not good. So what I can do now is I can say, actually install is nicer, I think. There we go. And because the JSON file that we have, the package file that we have, contains all the information about the packages that we want and so on, I can delete this node modules folder. I can delete the lock file that I have there, and simply running npm install will recreate all of that for me as well. Yeah. So that should put you in the position where we have now a JavaScript file, and in this JavaScript file, we can start to play with JavaScript syntax. I can start to explain next lesson, probably things like variables and types, and we can exercise that a little bit. And because of this NodeMon setup, if we do it properly, then every time we make a change here, we will immediately see what our result is that we get, which will make it very easy to test things and so on. Okay, if you have any questions, now would be a good time. Cedric, your question, how to clean the code automatically? Well, the way I did it, there are different ways you can do it, but the best way, I think, in this case would actually be if you look at the extensions and you search in the Visual Studio extensions, for example, you search for ESLint and you install that, and you search for, I think the other one that I did was Prettier, and you install that. And those two, when you activate them in Visual Studio Code, will start doing stuff like that. And you can see that Prettier, for example, is switched on. You can see which, well, if you click on it, you can see configuration there as well. There is a whole bunch of stuff that you can set in terms of options. But just go to the extensions tab, look for either ESLint or Prettier or one of the other ones that are available on the Microsoft site. Install them, make sure that they are active, and then they should start to clean up code as soon as they are enabled. And that's it's a mixed feeling for me, because I like to format the code exactly the way I want it. And this Prettier extension does not always agree with me. But the big advantage is that it's consistent. So it always does the right thing. And some of the preferences, for example, I would probably, if I would write it myself, I would probably prefer to have a space in between the bracket and the expression, because I think that's a little bit more legible. This plugin thinks I'm wrong. So for now, I've accepted its choices, but I'm sure if I would look into the configuration files, there is probably a way of configuring that so that it doesn't do that same thing anymore.
But as you said, it's constantly always wrong. So that's good. Same error always.
Sometimes being consistent is preferable, yes.
Sure. Preferable to be constantly wrong than sometimes wrong and sometimes good.
Yes. But definitely look at the it's really cool stuff. For example, at some point I had to deal with very big CSV files. Turns out that there is an extension that does color coding in CSV files. Again, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what I was doing. And there is some other stuff in there as well. I have some XML formatting. And you'll see that if you start using Visual Studio Code, sometimes when you open a file format that you haven't worked with before, there is going to be a little pop-up here that says there is an extension to deal with this file format, or to help you deal with that file format. Do you want to install it? And it's really worthwhile looking at some of these things. Okay, that's what I wanted to share today. I hope that you all more or less got to the same place as where I am, and you got it to work. Like I said, if you ran into issues, let me put this slide back on here as well. If you run into issues, or if you look at the video afterwards and you try to recreate what we did here, go to the 4-Piece Café Facebook page, ask your question. If you don't want to do it publicly because you think that you will be publicly shamed, which is not true, then you can always send me an email, and then I will post it on the Facebook group so that you can be publicly shamed. That will work as well. So, but ask before next week. My plan for next week, and believe me, I am evolving this plan while we're doing this, because this is new for me as well. So if you have questions or feedback, don't hold back and share. My plan for next week is to start looking at JavaScript syntax. So start looking at the language. And as in any language, that probably means we have to start with the supported types that you have in JavaScript, and how to do easy stuff with variables. That will be the first thing for sure. In the presentation, I will try to remember to also post this. I think I have more or less the same instructions. I hope they are the same instructions in there than what we did here. You have the npm run dev thing there, and then the nodemon installation and how to use it. So the instructions are there again, and I will post the PDF version of this presentation on the Facebook group as well. Okay, if there are no questions, then I'm assuming that all of you were able to follow. If not, I'm sure I will hear it afterwards.
Thank you, David.
Have a great Thursday. Go have a drink. You earned one.
Thanks so much, David.
You're very welcome. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.